So, hello everyone who's been hearing us chat for the last few minutes. I'm Jess Hill, and I'm convening this panel today on older women, housing, and family and domestic violence. Now, I'm coming to you from beautiful Gadigal country in Sydney, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and the custodians, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded here. Thanks also to Auntie Georgina Nicholson, Wurundjeri Elder, for her welcome to country. And I also want to acknowledge the particularly difficult and disproportionate, to put it mildly, housing and homelessness issues faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women due to ongoing racism and systemic and structural discrimination that's, really started during colonisation and has continued rather unfettered since. So I'm a journalist and author, and for those of you who don't know my work, just quickly to introduce, I've been working exclusively on the issue of family and domestic violence, or abuse as I prefer to call it, for the better part of a decade. My book, See What You Made Me Do, was published last year. It's been made into an SBS series. And the podcast series we were just chatting about just then is with the Victorian Women's Trust, and it's called The Trap. And I think, perhaps an issue that is one of the most crucial to creating safety for victim survivors, and possibly one of the least addressed, is affordable housing. And this is not just a priority or a preference, it's urgent. And I think that was made clear in the panel that we just saw with those parliamentarians and the lived experience survivor, Penny. This is a huge issue for women aged over 55. There's been a 55% increase in women aged 55 to 74 seeking support from homelessness services in the last decade. And family violence was the primary reason they were seeking help. And these women are in the fastest growing group of homeless people in Australia. And what's not in those figures are the number of older women who will stay with abusive partners or stay living with abusive family members, sons or daughters, just to keep a roof over their head, because they fear that they'll struggle to find a private rental and may have no choice but to end up living on a friend's couch, if that's even available, or living in their car. Of course, many older women will experience abuse from their children, as I said, and from carers and so on. So we're dealing with a much broader issue than just intimate partner abuse. Now, of course, you can look at figures for elder abuse, which I think are pretty hazy. Looks at there's some figures from Own Australia that look about 14% of older women are victims of elder abuse. But when you're talking about homelessness, you have to look really across the woman's life cycle, because the abuse that she may have been subjected to as a younger woman in her 30s, 40s, that could have set her on a trajectory towards homelessness in her 50s and 60s. So the lifetime prevalence of domestic abuse, and this is just intimate partner abuse, is 1 in 4 from the age of 16. 1 in 3 women report experiencing physical or sexual violence from a man. So these are huge numbers. And I think it's no wonder, when you think about the lifetime impacts that domestic abuse can have, that older women are becoming the new face of homelessness. I'd like to acknowledge the content of today's discussion may be upsetting for some members of our audience. So if you are feeling triggered by this, or you feel like this has really raised some hard issues for you, call Lifeline on 131114, or if your concern is about family violence in particular, 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. And details of this and the other services are in the chat. So to help us shift the agenda to action on housing solutions for older women, I am joined by Suzanah-Jo, who's a lived experience advocate, Jocelyn Bignold, the incredible head of McAuley Community Services for Women, Nemat Kharboutli from Muslim Women Australia, Annabelle Daniel from Women's Community Shelters. And each of our panelists is going to present for 5 minutes and share with us their perspectives and what action and solutions look like for them, and what they've found through their incredible work in terms of galvanizing both politicians but also community to support solutions that can really address this crisis. After they speak for 5 minutes, I'm going to ask our panelists some questions, and then we'll have a discussion. So we'll let each panelist speak for 5 minutes, and then I'll go back to the panelists, ask them some questions, and then we'll open up for chat. So except for the speakers, can everyone just make sure that they are on mute? Sounds like you are. We'll pick up some questions and themes from the chat, and that will help shape our discussion. So if you want to put your reflections in the chat, we'll try to absorb some of those as we're going, but also pick up on those questions explicitly later. They are also suggesting that if you're having trouble seeing who's speaking, use the speaker view function in Zoom. So I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Suzanah-Jo Day, otherwise known as Sue, is a lived experience advocate. Now, Sue lives at Mossman House, a medium-term supported transitional property for women over 50 through Women's Community Shelters, Link Housing, and Northern Beaches Women's Shelter. So Sue, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you speak now.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Sue. I'm 67 and I live at Mossman House on Gamagul land. My sister-in-law is actually Indigenous and she faces similar and even more complex issues. She's an older woman too. I'm really grateful to be here. There are over 400,000 women who are facing homelessness from trauma in Australia. Here's a short history on how we got here, or for me, how I feel. After World War II, women had been working on the land, driving heavy machinery, working as mechanics and in ammunition factories. Women lost their jobs to men when they came back from the war. Women swapped dungarees and pants for aprons. A government campaign with the aim of getting women back in the home was launched. Circulated were posters, newspapers, magazines, and books for women. The women looked like glamorous Hollywood wives. Women were depicted as perfect wives, mothers, housekeepers, cooks, etc., and living in rose-covered cottages with picket fence. If you didn't get married, the insinuation was that you were gay and not normal. That's where I came from. The effects of this propaganda were carried on into my generation.
Yes.
Sorry, I thought somebody said something. Yeah, it's all right. When I was a child, I was physically and sexually abused. I was controlled by men. I was scared of men. I've lived with the shame and secret of abuse until now. I got married at 18 thinking it would be better than home. The romance of marriage soon evaporated into violence. Expectations of a woman were low. Women were subordinate, women obeyed and was steered through life by their husbands, fathers, teachers, doctors, and any man in authority. Women were dependent on men. Men controlled the money. It wasn't until mid-70s that a woman could get a loan or allowed a line of credit. Couples tried to stay together and not divorce. No fault divorce did not come in until 1975. As a girl, I was raised as a caregiver, guilt-ridden for all of my life. I've given everything to other people, kids, everybody. When I separated and left with a baby, I was in a vulnerable position, homeless, broke, and with little support and no housing options. The only safe option left to me and my tiny son was a woman's shelter. There was nowhere else to go. Relationships that followed were abusive. I confused violence and sexual assault with intimacy. I was angry. I regarded kind and caring people with suspicion. Assault and abuse was a cycle I could not get out of until now. I was angry that men who split up usually kept their jobs, money, super, and freedom. The children mostly stay with the mother. The losers are women. In December 2020, my previous address became too expensive for me. I had used up savings and super to live there. I also had to get away from family violence. I found myself in a similar position as last time. I needed safety and support and affordable housing. Sydney rental prices exceeded my age pension. A unit was $900 a fortnight. My pension was $1,091 per fortnight. That left $191 per fortnight. This was to cover utilities, food, and car. I was ready to live in the back of my car, but Mossman House took me in. I'd always worked in the caring sector on a low income. I could not accumulate a good super. I couldn't save even after 50 years of work. Mossman House gave me safe and affordable housing. It was the first time I was able to step out of survival mode and work through the trauma I had survived. My past was not my fault. There was no intervention when I was a child experienced physical and sexual abuse. There was no protection from anyone. In fact, it was covered up. At Mossman House, I worked through the cycle of trauma. I had intense and weekly sessions with the refuge social worker over 9 months. She has also referred me to services and encouraged me to pursue a new life path. Lately, in addition, I've received counselling from a victim's psychologist. Now for me, pride and openness replaces shame and secrecy. Control over my life replaces chaos in my life. I'll be able to move on from Mossman House with an understanding of my past. My past patterns and pitfalls will not be repeated in the future. I have stepped off of the mouse wheel. I'm going to live for myself without guilt. My rage has dissipated. Mossman House has freed me from my past trauma as a survivor of sexual abuse and physical violence. Thank you.
Wow, Sue, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And I think, you articulate so well that we're seeing women like yourself on the back end of this massive trajectory of massive social inequality that was so present in the 50s, 60s and 70s that of course we still deal with now. But what happened in those decades has this ongoing effect for women now who are in their 50s and 60s now. I'm so glad that you found people who valued you and gave you safety and gave you that space.
I wouldn't be here without our social worker here. I'm nearly crying. If it weren't for her, I would be on that same mouse wheel. She just showed me, she's young, and she showed me that there's a path for me. So that whatever I've got left, I've got a path now that I just won't fall down those holes again, ever again. Yeah.
And look at you now.
Education. Yeah.
And you're speaking on a panel.
I've been terrified to come on, but I have to be here.
Yeah, no, but it's amazing. I just think incredible. What a long way that you've come in that way. And now you can bring that strength of your lived experience to actually helping others who are coming through the same thing and informing policy. So thank you, Sue.
Thank you too. You too.
Now, Sue, if you want to put yourself on mute now, and we'll come back to you after the speakers.
Yes.
And I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Jocelyn Bignold, who's the CEO of McAuley Community Services for Women. This is a Victorian organisation which provides support, advocacy and accommodation for women and their children who are homeless, primarily as a result of family violence or mental illness. Jocelyn, thank you so much for joining us. If you unmute yourself and put your video on, we'd love to hear from you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And Susanna, thank you so much for that. You give us all courage. I would like to, I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation today. And I also want to thank the female politicians that are in this forum for their bravery in being female politicians in Australia at the moment. I'll talk to you today about how McAuley responds to older women who are homeless due to family violence. We all know perpetrators of family violence use many tactics and behaviours that result in women being poor, ill, isolated from children and family, and ultimately homeless. Women often come to us after trying to manage their situation for 20 years. And I have to say, I've been shocked at the number of women who've said that they haven't recognised themselves as being homeless until they've actually lost their car. One case illustrates common themes, and this person, an older woman, worked in her small family business for over 20 years. She was never paid a wage, and she had no access to money to adequately feed her family. And she spent her spare time rummaging through bins to find enough food for everybody. And she didn't recognise her situation as being equivalent to family violence. Eventually, she was hospitalised through ill mental health and discharged to us, a homeless service. Living on her own would not have been easy at that time, and not least due to her ongoing fear of the perpetrator. Our response to her and many others like her was firstly to provide a safe place to rest and recover. And sometimes that can take up to 9 months. In our service, we have an on-site psychologist, a nurse, a financial and legal clinic. And one of the extraordinary things that they've been able to do in the last few years is they've resolved $900,000 worth of debt from 137 women. You can imagine the relief that is for women. We have social activities and informal peer support. We have assistance with daily living activities. We have opportunities to cook or not to cook. We have post-housing support because recovery is not always linear, and we have opportunities for people to stay connected if they wish. This type of service works for women who need time and extra support and a de facto home until they feel strong enough and have the supports to flourish in their own community. Hopefully, though, our future won't include women like this, because we will have either eliminated family violence at best, or at least have a system in place so they'll be better able to name what's happening to them and able to access support earlier. Poverty is a standout issue for all of the women that we see. Financial support and access to safe, affordable housing are key. Some older women who've moved through our service work at places like the Big Issue Women's Social Enterprise. They tell us that a decent hourly rate supplements their income. They make friends and they gain respect and acceptance from estranged family members. We know through a 2009 social return on investment report conducted by Deloitte Access Economics on 30 of our case studies that our service produces successful, individualised outcomes that are cost effective. The solution is easily replicable. What's needed is a safe place to be with in-house services, time to rest and recover, access to health, financial, legal and housing expertise, support to rebuild social and independent living skills. There is no lack of willingness within the social service sector to work in this way, and all of the people on our panel today will show you different examples. The problem is that funding is corralled into individual funding streams on the assumption that the services will meet at the point of need or at the point of referral. Instead, we need to be able to engage governments differently in order to explore effective models together, not through prescribed tenders which force round holes into square pegs. Have I said that right? Not through complicated and expensive social impact bonds, which governments end up paying for anyway. We need honest and direct dialogue with governments where cycles of services are iterated so we get to the better outcomes. We need commonly shared data, and we need to work on these good models together so that they can be replicated. Contracting for social outcomes is happening all around the world and used in large and small projects. We could be looking at innovative models of funding to fund these effective services, because we can't build the funding building blocks to keep these services together without that kind of dialogue and actual working together with government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joss. That everything what you're saying there feeds back so much into what we heard from some people at the summit last week, which was really that to come at domestic and family violence properly, you need holistic solutions. And actually, what a lot of people like yourself in the sector are doing is holistic And yet you are forced back. And when it comes to the end of that year at the funding point, you're forced to delineate that into all these little silos to make it make sense for government, so they can assign it to a bottom line. And it's just not how it works. No victim survivor says, oh yes, this is this part of my life that's being dealt with now, and now this is this. It's just their life. Thank you so much. Okay, now if you put you're already on mute, you're very effective. So next we have Nemat Kharboutli, who's the acting CEO at Muslim Women Australia. She has had pretty much a lifetime of involvement with MWA, and is such a champion for Muslim women and girls. This is a representative body for Muslim women that's working to enrich humanity and advocating for the equality and the rights of all women. What a great mission. MWA provides frontline specialist domestic violence, homelessness and settlement support for multicultural communities, as well as community development, educational and recreational initiatives for Muslim communities. Nemat, thank you so much for joining us. If you can take yourself off mute and put your video on.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks everyone. It's a real privilege to be here with you all today. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Older women from migrant and refugee backgrounds have invested so much of themselves to Australian society. As just mentioned, I'm here representing Muslim Women Australia due to that investment of women 40 years ago who gave and continue to give so much to their children, their grandchildren, their communities, and Australian society at large, both socially and economically. I'm here today to speak to the need for nuanced solutions to provide dignified supports that are inclusive of all women, so no woman gets left behind as they age. We often simplify homelessness as an issue caused by individual circumstances, as we heard today with Sue and with Penny earlier. And we don't often give enough attention to the structural barriers or abuse which creates disadvantage. We need to design systems with a gendered lens that are universally accessible and change the lens by which we view families, both intergenerationally and collectively. Nationally, MWA works in 4 states, advocating for the rights of all women, including women from migrant and refugee backgrounds and representing Muslim women. We have a very strong service footprint in New South Wales. For 38 years, we've supported culturally and linguistically diverse communities, experiencing domestic violence and homelessness with safe and supported crisis and transitional accommodation, rapid rehousing, and intensive support for clients with complex needs, as well as women, supporting women in their own choice of home. At MWA, we utilise a therapeutic model that is client-centred and trauma-informed and ensures that it's culturally, religiously, and linguistically appropriate. MWA has these existing models with processes and policies and amazing experienced staff. We operate the largest multicultural specialist homelessness service in New South Wales, known as our Linking Heart service, and we're also a registered community housing provider. Social and affordable housing is inextricably linked to domestic and family violence and homelessness support, and it is essential to effective, qualified, dignified outcomes. The gendered impact and the intersection of family violence, housing and homelessness is well documented, as you've heard today. We know from the evidence that domestic and family violence is the leading cause of homelessness amongst women and children. 50% of women who leave a violent partner report they're the ones to leave the home. That there are limited and complex housing pathways which place victim survivors in a situation of greater housing uncertainty, and that often leads them to delaying leaving a perpetrator. That there are safe at home measures that require women to take on a financial burden with minimal income and minimal rental history. And as we know, that older women are the fastest growing cohort of homeless persons. Supporting women should centre on safety and affordability. We need specialist models of family violence service provision that are inclusive of integrated, place-based housing first models that are supporting cowed women and cowed older women experiencing homelessness and survivors of elderly abuse. And it's required now during this pandemic more than ever. The older women we support experiencing violence don't just experience intimate partner violence, but they experience it in family-based settings, and as previously mentioned, covert forms of homelessness like overcrowding and couch surfing. Their needs extend to safe and affordable housing, but it also intersects with communication barriers, migration status, cultural diversity, and extended family caring structures, and can be exacerbated by the digital divide that makes services difficult to navigate, as well as the unconscious biases and discrimination that migrant women often encounter. Our experience highlights the spectrum of intersecting needs across the continuum, that the needs of the first or second generation are distinct to those of who undertook the migration journey themselves, and that those are distinct from newly arrived communities, such as refugees and asylum seekers, or women on temporary visas as they age. Women on temporary visas experiencing violence often cannot access income support or crisis payment, and face additional barriers to accessing temporary, crisis, transitional, social, or community housing. This pandemic has shone a very bright light on the issues for older women. As part of our social and economic recovery, we need to take note of the impact of gender inequality across all the areas mentioned before in the political panel. And we need to see housing as a critical infrastructure for those who are lucky enough to have one. The efficacy of this critical infrastructure should not just be viewed in terms of volume, bricks and mortar, and critical mass solutions, even though that's necessary. We need to have a multi-tiered strategy that ensures it acts as essential scaffolding that fosters social capital, community resilience, and dignified models of healing. We need to invest in community-led specialist solutions. We need to make the invisible visible with dignity and work holistically to reduce the impacts of gender inequality on women as they age. And we need to ensure that for 49% of Australians who have one or both parents born overseas, and that older women from migrant and refugees backgrounds in the now, who have already given so much and still have so much to contribute, are part of that future and part of our service delivery responses. And we need to make sure that as we work in the present towards the future, that migrant and refugee women are central to these processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nemat. You know, I think there's so much in what you just said, and particularly, again, like, you know, going back to the Women's Safety Summit, not only holistic solutions, what people were talking about, but that community-led, and the fact that, you know, you don't just have strategies land from the federal government in every community and just roll them out. I mean, even though what Joss is saying is right about, you know, how you can replicate things, it is that, you know, as Joss would say, you know, replicating it, but making it place-based. And I think your point about bricks and mortar, it's like, that's the easy stuff. That's like literally money in a bank account, you know, and like, you know, tradies on site. The rest of it, community resilience and building communities of support, especially for cold women, so necessary. Thank you so much. We'll come back to you. So now we come to our fourth and last panelist, last but not least, Annabelle Daniel, who is CEO of Women's Community Shelters, an incredible community-based organisation that has really filled the gap left by the New South Wales government in terms of establishing refuges, and especially with that specialist feminist advocacy backing them. In this role, Annabelle has worked with local communities around New South Wales to establish and open 6 shelters at Hornsby, Foster, Castle Hill, Penrith, Bayside, and Parramatta. So thank you, Annabelle. I'll leave it to you to speak for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions.
Thanks so much, Jess. And I did have a presentation, but I feel like this is a friendly audience and a friendly environment. So I think I might just talk a bit about what we do. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from unceded Gadigal land this morning and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal people present on the call today. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Sue from Mossman House for telling her story, which I think just brings it home to all of us how important and how immediate this work is. And if there's any point, you know, that I would want people to leave with today before I talk a little bit about what we're doing at Women's Community Shelters, is that this is an issue that cannot afford to wait for any more years for us to do things about it. There are, you know, this growing cohort of older women need support and they need assistance now. And quite often, the time it takes for government solutions to work their way through the pipeline can be can be just too long. We can actually take actions at the grassroots level in communities to do things to solve these problems now. Women's Community Shelters is a fairly young organisation. We started operations almost 9 years ago. Our first shelter was established prior to WCS, and that's the Northern Beaches Women's Shelter, which is located in Manly. And that was based very much in response to a local need where there were over 300 women per year who were approaching the local community centre looking for a safe place to go. And that community centre had been advocating to both state and federal government for over 20 years to establish a refuge in the area, and they kept getting knocked back. And so the founders, which included Ellie and Peter Hunt, Ellie was volunteering at that centre, and she went home one night to Peter and said, you know what? We are just going to do this ourselves. And they actually underwrote the establishment costs of the shelter in Manly for the first few years and brought community around that project to actually get it up and running. And so with philanthropy and community fundraising, they established a 10-bed women's shelter, providing crisis support, accommodation and casework support with social inclusion and local involvement to provide that support. And one of the very first cohorts we were supporting were older women who'd led incredibly conventional lives, very much like, you know, our lived experience of advocates have spoken to at every point this morning, who, you know, through death, divorce, illness, disability, loss of an affordable rental, found themselves on the precipice of homelessness. And so after the establishment of the Manly Women's Shelter, the founders thought, well, is this a social franchise model that could be replicated elsewhere? And that's how women's community shelters came into being. And so we now actually have established over the course of the last 8 years, 7 shelters in total. We have another 2 that will be opening towards the end of this year. But a few years ago, what we started was a program of transitional housing, which provides that very important next step once someone has progressed through crisis accommodation shelters. And we worked with the PACE Foundation, who had properties that were underutilised for a few years. And they had said to us, you know, could you do something with these? We don't need to use them. They're eventually going to be demolished. Could they provide the next stage of housing for your residents? And we said, absolutely, yes. And so what I think the bigger point I want to make out of this too is that in addition to building social housing, you know, which we know is absolutely necessary and foundational to support women and children and older women, we also know that there are a huge amount of suitable properties that are sitting empty every night right now. And we can do things with those properties. There are properties that are going through the planning cycle. There are aged care facilities. There are residential properties that are sitting on state land. There are any number of pieces of land which have been earmarked for some future development, which could be repurposed with smaller homes, demountables or other builds. And again, it goes to the urgency of the issue. Building hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands or millions of homes will take time, no matter when we commit to it. And this issue is urgent. We need to do it now. And so in building our meanwhile use program, we partnered with Link Wentworth and Twilight Aged Care, who had facilities that were in the planning cycle. And we created Beecroft House and Mossman House, where Sue is a resident, which provide transitional housing for 20 and 18 older women. And with that additional professional support, as Sue mentioned, we have our wonderful Kate at Mossman House, who's just incredible, and workers to support that. But if I was to sum up the magic sauce, it's the housing, it is the professional support, but it is also so important that we think about the social inclusion and participation and communities wrapping around women as support and as that inclusion, because that's what makes life meaningful. And I don't think we can leave that out of the equation when we talk about these solutions. What's also incredibly important is that we offer older women choice. Not everybody wants to be shoehorned into a tiny home. Not everybody wants to you know, to live somewhere temporarily, some people will need to make a transition to a property. Some people have caring responsibilities for grandchildren or other family members. And so choice and dignity are also essential in the choices that we offer. I'm really excited that we're working to extend our housing pathways and look at even more opportunities for meanwhile use. Between 2018 and 2020, we were able to provide an increase from about 2,500 to close to 20,000 safe bed nights. So almost a 300% increase in safety and safe housing that we were able to offer. And I would love to see these models replicate elsewhere, because they're not in any way reliant on government to activate them. And I think there's so much more that we can do in this space by working from the grassroots up, activating local communities, activating local government, and looking at clever solutions like this to bridge the gap. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle. And I love your absolute pragmatism. It really reminds me, I was speaking to Anne Summers the other day, and, it really reminds me of Elsie's and how that all started. They're just walking up and down the street in Glebe looking for an abandoned house, established squatters' right, move in. And if they'd waited for government to fund the first women's refuge, they probably would still be waiting. Let's be honest. So I think there is that thing of showing, having something to show first. And I get exactly what you're saying, that being agile and looking around and going, what have we already got? We don't need necessarily right now, we need to plan for the future, but for those women who are now tonight wondering where they're going to sleep, where can we put them, and then what community can we build around them? And it's so clear, I think, that people like you, lived experience advocates, everyone on this panel sort of has those same ideas about what older women need, what women and kids in general need. It's amazing to see all of that thinking just get tighter and tighter across the sector. And I hope the government, or whatever future government we have to look forward to, is listening. So I want to come back to Sue and just ask, this may be a lot of pressure, Sue, but just to ask you, if you were to meet with the Prime Minister or Minister for Women, what would you want them to do first to address the issue of domestic violence and homelessness among older women?
Let me just say, I did make some notes for this. We need crisis housing, we need affordable housing, and we need housing built now. And as far as domestic violence goes, yes, up the training for police, and prevention, just before the domestic violence actually happens, prevention. There's ads on TV at the moment about stopping any wording towards women and abuse, any abuse. Yeah, so that's a very good start. It's a good campaign. Okay.
Thanks, Sue. And you touched on this a little bit earlier. The service system is really designed to support people who are tech savvy and know what services are available. So how would you recommend to the government for the system to change to support older women who are at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness?
Well, I had to think about that, and really there should be some sort of way of getting the message through to libraries. There's councils, place of worship, women's groups, doctor surgeries, hospitals, even TV, social media, brochures, all these kinds of ways can sort of get through to women who are in a crisis situation.
I think, and that goes back to that whole idea of building community around this. And it seems that what part of the mission in trying to get people to understand the prevalence of this issue is to get local communities to really take this on as their issue, and that this is really at the heart of the lack of cohesion and the harm that is being done to members of every community. no matter where that community is, so that, I mean, yes, I agree with all of that. Thank you, Sue.
Sorry, can I just add something? The
course.
community here were ready for us. People have come up to me and said, oh, we know about you. We'd like to see the building. We'd like to, and they've asked me questions. How many of us are here? They're all ready. Yeah, it was really great.
Wonderful. That's
Yeah.
so good. And isn't that amazing? Like, don't you just feel so welcomed, and like, there is now potential and possibility that support is around you.
And it really highlights to me that there's more to the problem than just being homeless. It's there's more to it, and people around you realize that too. They want members of the community to be safe, and housed.
It's gorgeous.
Now,
Annabelle, there's actually been a couple of questions coming up in the chat for you as well. And I think one of the questions, or two questions combined really, is how do we find unused space for meanwhile use?
Mm-hmm.
And a more specific one was, why can't we use unused space, like old unused warehouses, old Bunnings buildings? Obviously, they would need some adaptations. But yeah, can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that we found was a lot of it built organically out of our work at the local community level to establish shelters. Because we're not actually predominantly funded by government at all, my organisation is completely reliant on philanthropy and corporate partnerships, and our shelter network has a level of funding from the New South Wales state government, but a lot of it's done by community fundraising and philanthropy. And so when we establish a shelter, we work with a local community to find a local champion who's going to lead the project and build a steering community of people around that who, might not have had anything to do with either the housing, homelessness or DV sectors before, but they might be focused on a great local project or a local business owner or a representative of a school. And I think by bringing people to this issue and making it place-based, that's where we can start to unearth things. In every area where we have established a shelter, we have had discussions with the local councils. Many local councils do have some or underutilised properties. They're also well connected with local developers in the region who they might be approving buildings to go forward or areas to be developed, and they can link in, as part of an education process with developers who might be looking to also incorporate some level of social license in the build that they're doing, or the meanwhile use of the property. I think it is literally boots on the ground in communities unearthing these. And since we started our Pathways to Home project a few years ago, we've had conversations with developers. We've presented to the Property Council of New South Wales. We've worked with aged care providers. And I really feel that this is actually developing a bit of a snowball effect. The more we talk about it and the more we do it, the more it plants the idea and the seed with landlords that meanwhile use is a really good thing to do. If you've got a property that is suitable, residential, and we can have it for more than 12 months, it's potentially a goer, and we should be making all use of this to address the homelessness crisis and to give people that stability.
Yeah, it's really exciting, and I think that the idea that women's community shelters has, that sort of fundamental idea of using what you've got, and just getting started, it's really contagious. I think people get really excited by the idea that that we could do this now, and not that we have to plan and wait, even though obviously that's necessary on a lot of different fronts. But it's a great thing, this sort of stopgap. Let's build now.
Yes,
I think
can I jump into that conversation a little bit, because I think it is really important. I think what women's community shelters have done is really innovative about bringing philanthropy and industry into this space. But I also think that there is a role for state and federal governments when it comes to meanwhile use, and it's about really looking at also resourcing smaller community housing providers to scale up that work, looking at co-contributor models that could also support that work, especially in metropolitan areas and also, rural and remote areas, because I think there's scope for improved planning processes at the local government level. There's room for fast tracking planning processes, and we need to do it in a way that also gives opportunities for existing specialist providers in this space to scale up their models in a way that also mitigates organizational liability and stays connected to the communities that they're operating in. So I think I fully agree that there's real ways that we can do that with what we currently have in existing metropolitan areas. And we know for multicultural communities, core and cluster models, keeping them connected to social connections and diaspora communities, and especially with working with older women, shared settings where there is some children around that might not be their own children, that really improves their psychosocial well-being as well. So I think there is an opportunity to look at meanwhile use in from a few different lenses, and I think we it's really great to see those models in play, but we don't need to let the local and state and federal governments off the hook, because they can really play a role in fast tracking those planning processes, looking at how land and housing what is government-owned land, what can be used on those government-owned land in existing things. So we definitely need a tiered and multi-layered approach to addressing this issue, because affordable housing contribution scheme take time. Building new things take time. So we absolutely need to see this as a short and medium term solution as we work to build a longer term strategy.
That's, beautifully said, Nemat, and exactly the sorts of things that you hope governments are hearing. I think wondering with you, when you're working in Muslim communities, and obviously there are a lot of older women experiencing family violence who just do not feel like there is any possibility of presenting at a service for so many reasons. How can we better reach out to older women from these communities and reassure them that they will be helped and that there is a possibility of safety for them?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I think it's really important that we look at this a lot more holistically. So for Muslim women specifically, they come from over 183 ethnic backgrounds, and we support Muslim women, but we also support all multicultural women, from multicultural backgrounds, right from sort of a multitude of geographic areas in New South Wales specifically, plus we work in building capacity across different states to do that work. But I definitely think we need to look at the work much more holistically. We shouldn't silo the way that we do our community education, the way that we look at coercive control, the way that we look at a whole range of post-separation abuse. And the reason that's important is because we need to have a much broader focus on prevention and community education that really includes older women as part of those whole of community strategies. I think we forget sometimes, and it's a shame, how much older women have contributed, and that they still have so much to contribute. We really need a strengths-based empowerment model in working with older women that really brings to the highlight their resilience and their resistance in this space and makes them feel confident to connect and to reach out. And if I can give just one example of a case that we supported in June last year, I think it really highlights a lot of the nuances and the complexities in this space. Last year, right at the back of lockdown and the increasing restrictions, we had a woman who, an elderly woman, she's 66 years old, who presented to our service. And she had confided in her nephew that a woman that she was living with had physically and verbally assaulted her and was limiting access to her family and was actually financially abusing her. She suffered with the abuse of this woman for 5 years. That was a so-called friend. And she took advantage of her, using her car, her phone, her superannuation that were all now under her control. And in doing so, she sort of chaperoned her and controlled her behaviour by chaperoning her shopping, chaperoning her counselling appointments. And, all of this was under the guise that she was supporting her because of her limited English. And this woman had never heard of the term elder abuse. She didn't know what that means. But it was, when she approached our service and when she reached out to her nephew, it was her nephew who put her in touch with us, who connected her with our service. And we provided a whole range of integrated and coordinated case management plans for her. And now she's doing an amazing job. But we need to have a broader focus at the way that we do this from a service delivery perspective. And I agree with what Jocelyn was saying earlier about trying to fit, square pegs into round holes. And I think we need to think a little bit more broadly. Services like ours and many others in this space that are government funded right at the end. And the work that we do extends so much farther than that. And the expertise that we have can have a much broader impact in this space. So I think we need to do that. And then as mentioned, we advocate for the structural reform that was mentioned in the political sessions earlier. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can do better. We all absolutely have a role in doing that. And we need to make sure that, we're doing it in a way that brings every woman along for the ride. Every woman benefits from it, and that we don't forget just because it might not be our own experience.
Thank you so much, Nemat. And Jocelyn, we've got a couple of minutes left. All of you I'd like to hear speaking for an hour on your own. So I'm sorry that time's been so poor. But I wonder, especially, the voices of older people are obviously often not heard, not prioritised, not thought of as important, even in this particular conversation about family violence. So what do you think the sector can do together to change this and to advocate for older women's housing justice?
Yeah, look, I think a little bit similar to what Nemat was saying, was around visibility of role models across all walks of life in the media, and it's different cultural representations, First Nations representations, older women representations, and then people start to look to those role models. And what we're doing in particularly with us is we are working with established victim survivor groups and consulting with them and paying them properly for their time. And that's important because money is, as we've all heard today, money is really important. And as at a community level, we need to break down stereotypes. Again, as Nemat says, it's about respecting and recognising all of the contributions that women make, particularly older women who've made across their whole lifetimes, as Sue said this morning, and our other people with lived experience have said so articulately well this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Joss. Now, I can't believe we've got 2 minutes left. I think that what the panel has shared today, I've learned so much from. I think that if we're hearing more and more of these really clear solutions, but also different ways of thinking, that this is going to filter through to government, and hopefully we're in the next national plan, we can broaden our thinking to really be taking these holistic solutions, community-led initiatives, support for women and kids that goes beyond, as Nemat says, goes beyond bricks and mortar, but make sure the bricks and mortar are in place. So thank you to everyone for joining this at-risk event today as a call to action on ending homelessness for older women. We're going to rejoin the main group now for a wrap-up. So if people want to leave the room, we'll be rejoining the main group at 12:55. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. You're all just such wonderful members of our community, and we're so grateful for you.